I'll never forget the night I stayed at my aunt's cabin in the woods. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway, just me, my aunt, and the calm surroundings of nature. It's the kind of place where you could forget about the world for a while, but I should have known better than to let my guard down. The cabin was old, maybe 50 or 60 years, and had that musty, nostalgic smell to it. My aunt had lived there for years, but always seemed to want to get away to the city when the weather got too cold. I always liked coming up to visit her, though, even if the place was a little on the eerie side. It was peaceful, quiet, and far from anyone else. The first night was uneventful. I helped my aunt clean up the cabin, and we sat by the fireplace, chatting about old family stories. The usual. But after I went to bed, that's when the strange things started happening. I woke up around 2 a.m. Something about the air felt different, thicker, heavier, like it was pressing in on me. I lay there in the dark for a while, trying to figure out what had woken me. That's when I heard it. A faint knock on the door. I thought it was my aunt. Maybe she needed help with something, or maybe the wind had blown something against the door. But the knock wasn't like any wind. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone's knuckles tapping. At first, I tried to ignore it, but the knocking didn't stop. It was just too precise, too intentional. I got up and walked to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked out the window, there was nothing. No person, no vehicle, just the woods. But the air felt wrong. It was colder than it should have been for that time of year. The wind was still, too still, like the world had gone quiet. I pulled the curtains back, locked the door, and went back to bed, trying to brush it off as nothing. But it felt like someone, or something, was watching me. The next day, I told my aunt about the knocking. She chuckled at first. "The woods play tricks on you sometimes," she said. But there was something in her voice that made me doubt her words. It wasn't the first time she'd mentioned the odd things happening around the cabin. The second night was worse. It was just past midnight when I woke up again. This time, the house was eerily silent, and the temperature had dropped significantly. I could see my breath in the air despite the fire still burning in the living room. Something wasn't right. I heard the faintest sound, scratching. At first, I thought it was an animal outside, but then I realized it was coming from within the house. I got out of bed and walked toward the hallway, my feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The scratching continued, and I could hear it coming from the door to the attic. My heart skipped a beat. I knew no one had been up there, and the attic had always been locked. I hesitated for a moment, then walked toward the door. The scratch was growing louder, more frantic, like something trying to get out. I slowly turned the knob and pushed the door open, but there was nothing there, just darkness. I felt a cold breeze rush past me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I slammed the door shut and locked it again. I wasn't going up there, not alone, not tonight. The next morning, I decided to get some fresh air. I needed to clear my head. My aunt was in the kitchen making breakfast, humming to herself like nothing was wrong. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I went for a walk through the woods trying to find some peace, but every step I took felt like the trees were closing in on me. It wasn't long before I realized I had wandered off the path and was deep into unfamiliar territory. I looked around, trying to find my bearings, but the woods had a strange, disorienting quality to them. The trees seemed to be shifting, bending in ways that felt unnatural. My stomach churned, and I began to hurry back, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was following me. When I finally made it back to the cabin, my aunt was nowhere to be found. I called out for her, but there was no answer. I searched the cabin, checking each room, but there was no sign of her. The only sound was the low hum of the fridge and the creaking of the wooden floorboards under my feet. I went outside, and there she was, standing at the edge of the woods, staring into the trees. Her face was blank, almost empty, as if she wasn't seeing the world around her. I called her name, but she didn't respond. I rushed over to her, shaking her shoulders, trying to get her attention. That's when she spoke, her voice flat, distant. "He's here." "Who?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "The one who comes when it's quiet," she whispered. "He's always watching." I tried to lead her back inside, but she resisted. "You don't understand," she said. "He's waiting for you." Her eyes were wide, unfocused, and I could see the terror beneath the surface, even though she wasn't showing it outwardly. I couldn't take it anymore. I dragged her inside, locked the door, and called for help. The phone lines were dead, and the storm clouds that had started gathering overhead were beginning to form something unnatural. A heavy, dark mist rolled in from the woods. We spent the rest of the day huddled in the cabin, but the atmosphere had shifted. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against the windows made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, as the storm raged outside, I heard it again, the soft knocking at the door. But this time it was different. It wasn't on the door itself. It was on the walls, on the windows, on the roof. Soft tapping sounds, as if something was trying to get inside. I grabbed my aunt and we barricaded ourselves in the smallest room in the cabin, the one with the old wooden door. I could hear whispers, soft, almost inaudible voices that seemed to come from nowhere. The walls seemed to pulse, as if something was inside them, waiting. Suddenly, the door creaked open. I froze. My aunt's eyes went wide, her face pale. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow stood in the doorway, its outline blurry, indistinct. It seemed to shift and change as it moved. I could barely make out the figure of a man, or something that had once been a man. His face was obscured by darkness, but I could feel the coldness of his presence. It was like being in the room with death itself. And then it spoke, its voice not a whisper, but a low growl that resonated deep in my chest. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice like gravel scraping against metal. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't human. It stepped closer, and I could feel the air grow colder, thinner, as if the very room we were in was shutting down. I turned to my aunt, but she wasn't there anymore. There was just an empty, hollow space where she had been standing. The shadow grew larger, closer. And then, everything went black. I woke up hours later, lying on the floor of the cabin. The storm had stopped. The air was still, too still. I looked around, and my aunt was gone. I searched the cabin frantically, but she was nowhere to be found. The only thing left was a single note, written in a hand I didn't recognize. It simply read, "He's still watching." I've never been back to that cabin, and I never will. And I still wonder, every night, if whatever was in that cabin is still out there, waiting, watching.